It's not starting. Good afternoon, and welcome to our online discussion of euthanasia, assisted suicide, and other end-of-life practices from the point of view of people with disabilities. My name is Amy Hasbrook, and I am the director of Toujours Vivant, Not Dead Yet. And it's possible you will also hear from my cat, EO, who isn't sure what she wants right now. Okay. This is our discussion for October 31st, 2014. First, I want to thank you for being with us and explain a little bit what is Toujours Vivant, Not Dead Yet. We are a project of the Council of Canadians with Disabilities to inform, unify, and give voice to the disability opposition to assisted suicide, euthanasia, and other end-of-life practices that have a discriminatory effect on people with disabilities. We obviously are opposed, and there are several key reasons why we are opposed. First, it's unnecessary because everyone already has the option either to commit suicide or to refuse medical treatment and food and water and have palliative care until such time as they die from natural causes. Secondly, the practice of euthanasia and assisted suicide is discriminatory because we have a public policy to prevent suicides, but when we legalize assisted suicide and euthanasia, that practice is suspended where it applies to people with disabilities. So a non-disabled person who expresses a desire to die will be, we will try to prevent that person from killing themselves, whereas a person with a disability, because that is usually the first eligibility criteria, whether or not they also have a terminal illness, the person will be encouraged and helped to do so. Third, we believe that the choice to die cannot be free as long as people with disabilities don't have the choice in where and how they live. And finally, safeguards do not prevent people with disabilities from being killed in jurisdictions where these practices are legal. So those are the key reasons that we oppose. The goal of our online discussion is to give people with disabilities an option and a forum to talk about this from our own point of view. Usually this discussion ends up being divided between, on the one hand, liberal progressive types who support assisted suicide and euthanasia because they believe that people are actually have a choice. And on the other side are religious and conservative people who use sanctity of life and really regressive because we take into account the sociological, economic, and political effects that people with disabilities are subject to that push us to want to kill ourselves and that prevent us from being having the same safety net as suicide prevention that non-disabled people have. So those are some of the to have this discussion among ourselves, just kind of understand the experience that people with disabilities have with the medical system, which is much more in-depth. And finally, the experience that we have dealing with discrimination on a day-to-day basis that informs our opinion and our point of view. And it's often helpful to have that discussion among ourselves because people in the other camps don't necessarily understand the issue that we're faced with. So having a discussion can sometimes be kind of difficult with those other groups. There are several ways to participate in our online discussion. First, you can join us on video via Google Hangouts on Air. And if you go to the Google Hangouts, Google Plus Hangouts on Air, you can just sign right into our discussion. You can also go to YouTube and look up under Euthanasia and Disability. You'll find my channel and be able to sign on and ask questions, write down questions which will appear in my question box. And finally, you can go to our website and select the events tab and select today's date, and you will find our chat for today. So there's several ways to participate. And finally, for more information about what I talk about today, you can go to our website, which is tvndy.ca. You can also go to our Facebook page, which is at facebook.com/toujours vivant, not dead yet, all one word. And you could go to our Twitter feed, which is @TVNDY, or you can email me at info@tv-ndy.ca. So those are the ways to get in touch with me. Today's topic, we're going to spend most of the time talking about the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and I also have a couple of news briefs coming up. Okay, so earlier this month, we had a meeting, a strategic planning meeting, and at that meeting, we discussed the importance of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities as a tool to assisted suicide and the legalization of suicide and euthanasia. One of the things that we determined at that meeting is that it's very important to raise awareness of the convention, because I know about it properly implemented, but very few people know that. And so we decided that we need to do some awareness raising, and so here I am raising awareness. I take my job seriously, even though I'm laughing. The convention was signed in 2006 and ratified by Canada in 2010. Whoops, excuse me. 140 countries have signed, but it has not been ratified by the United States, and that is a whole messy political problem that I am not going to get into today, but I'm sure if you wanted to talk to somebody from Not Dead Yet in the United States, they would be happy to explain it. The cat is meowing. The convention has sections that can apply to assisted suicide and euthanasia, as well as sections that apply to the conditions that cause people to make such requests, because it doesn't really make much sense for us to try to prevent legalization of assisted suicide and euthanasia without addressing the problems that that diminish people's quality of life. And that's always something we've focused on, is trying to deal with those issues. We're not just a one-hit wonder, or a one-trick pony, I should say. So when I talk about the sections in the convention, I will be talking about lots of different things that relate to other aspects of life with a disability. And I'm certainly not going to cover anywhere near all of the convention, but I'm just going to give you some highlights that both relate directly to assisted suicide and euthanasia, and also relate to improving the quality of life of people with disabilities. So in the preamble, Section D makes reference to several other conventions and treaties that have gone before that support human rights and freedoms that shall be applied to people with disabilities. The cat wants to go out. Do you really want to go out? Hold on, I have to let the cat out. Just a sec. Because you're going to be yelling at me all day if I don't let you out. Sorry. Quiet, you. Excuse me. Sorry about that. She would be yelling at me all today. Okay. If discrimination against any person on the basis of disability is a violation of the inherent dignity, oh, I'm sorry. This is section H. I thought I saw the word F, but it's actually an H. In section H of the preamble, one of the principles that guides the creation of the convention is that discrimination against any person on the basis of disability is a violation of the inherent dignity and worth of that human person. So I think we can all agree on that. Section J says that the need to promote, that the convention is based on the need to promote and protect the human rights of all persons with disabilities, including those who require more intensive support. And I think this is very important because I will be talking later about the case of Nancy Fitzmaurice, who was a 12-year-old girl whose mother decided that she had such a low quality of life that she should be starved to death. And so the court allowed that, and she was. And this is, gets to the question of people who have intense medical needs and the perception by society of what that means in terms of quality of life and how that affects people's, the way euthanasia and assisted suicide are applied against people with disabilities. And I say against in this case. Section K of the preamble talks about persons with disabilities, that we continue to face barriers in our participation as equal members of society and violation of our human rights in all parts of the world. And so this is despite laws and treaties that already exist. We continue to face this kind of discrimination and devaluation. And this is part of what the convention is trying to address. Also, section V of paragraph V of the preamble states, emphasizes the importance of accessibility to the physical, social, economic, and cultural environment to health and education and information and communication for people with disabilities to ensure that we have actual equality, because certainly in the Canadian Constitution and the Quebec Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and in many other places, people with disabilities is written into these documents, but without specific provisions to ensure access to different facets of life, those promises are absolutely meaningless. So that is why it's important to write specific laws that address this. And because of the way Canada's laws work, there is no federal law to deal with this. So the fact that there's an international law that Canada has ratified could really help us as advocates it gives us a tool to work with the federal government to create a nationwide basis of standards for accessibility, for example, which we don't really have. Okay, so let's move on to Article 3, which is general principles. In Section A, we have one of the principles is the respect for the inherent dignity, individual autonomy, including the freedom to make one's own choices, and independence of persons with disabilities. So those are some basic ideas in the law. Some of the other basic principles are, or general principles, I should say, are non-discrimination and full and effective participation and inclusion in society. And though that is one of the things, the isolation and exclusion is what many people talk about when they become disabled. They can no longer participate, they can no longer do activities that they had enjoyed before, and often that's because of lack of access. If somebody was a gardener around anymore, beds would be a good solution. but people don't think of that. So thinking about accessibility is important. Okay, so Article 4 has to deal with general obligations, and this is what the convention, I should say, what the convention says that the states or countries have to do to be in compliance. And one thing they have to do is take into account the protection and promotion of human rights of persons with disabilities in a program that they develop, like a program to provide arts funding. They need to take into account the needs of people with disabilities, so they can't fund projects that are held in accessible places. That's the idea of incorporating accessibility into the programs. They need to, figure out how they're going to make it available for people who need sign language interpreters, schedule performance with a sign language interpreter and advertise that in the deaf community. That kind of thing needs to be done. Countries also need to refrain from engaging in any act or practice that is inconsistent with the present convention, and to ensure that public authorities and institutions act in conformity with the present convention. So two things. One is the governments can't do anything that's out of conformity, such as, for example, passing a law that allows assisted suicide. And secondly, they have to make sure that public authorities and institutions act in conformity with the law, with the convention. So, for example, when the government runs a nursing home or pays for a nursing home to take care of people, that nursing home needs to be run in harmony with the way that the convention talks. So there's a section on not providing degrading treatment. So the nursing home would have to be run in such a way that people don't feel degraded. Those would be important sections to take into account. Again, this is all the goal of the law. And let me just get to the end of this section here. Another of the state's obligations is in the making of laws and other decision-making processes concerning issues relating to persons with disabilities, states parties shall closely consult with and actively involve persons with disabilities. Now, this section actually says through their representative groups. And this is consistent with a problem that exists a lot here in Canada, less in the United States, and I don't really know that much in other places, but certainly in Quebec, very much, a lot of the organizations that are supposed to represent the voice of people with disabilities are not run by people with disabilities. Or they may have one or two on the board, but their policies and their direction do not represent the needs of people with disabilities. It feels more like a service provider, that the priorities of the organization are for providing services in an efficient fashion rather than meeting the needs of people with disabilities. And so when these are the groups that are representing, that are making the decisions, that can cause a conflict of interest with people with disabilities. And that's one reason that it's a huge concern to ensure that it's actual people with disabilities who are on these committees. So that's something to keep in mind. But another point that I want to make here, and I will emphasize this later as well, is when you have a law like this, it's a great law, and it could really do a lot, but these laws don't enforce themselves. When I worked at the Independent Living Center in Massachusetts, right after the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed, I did trainings for people with disabilities, and I said that there won't be an ADA superhero who will come down and defend your rights for you. That isn't how it works. You have to, we as individuals have to defend our rights, and there are the ADA gives us some tools and some power, but it's us who has to do the work. So, and that's the same with this kind of convention. And this convention doesn't, even though Canada has ratified it, it doesn't really have the force of law that some other, that, for example, the Constitution of Canada or an actual statute created by the Parliament would have. But what it does have is moral and public relations value. So that's what we really need to use when we think about this convention. And so it's our job as activists to use it and try to make it turn out to be what make the promises come true, essentially. Okay, I'll stop speechifying here. Article 5 has to do with equality and non-discrimination. And it says that states parties shall prohibit all discrimination on the basis of disability and guarantee to persons with disabilities equal and effective legal protection against discrimination on all grounds. So if we say that euthanasia and assisted suicide are discrimination because non-disabled people get suicide prevention, and people with disabilities are steered away from suicide prevention by such laws that consider us automatically eligible for suicide, whereas a non-disabled person wouldn't be, that would be the section that we could use to push that point home. Article 5, the equality and non-discrimination article. So that's, again, an example of what we could use. Article 6 has to do with, Article 8, rather, has to do with awareness raising. And there are a couple of things I pulled out of here. One is that states have a responsibility to combat stereotypes, prejudices, and harmful practices relating to persons with disabilities, including those based on sex and age in all areas of life. Okay, so that's the mandate on the countries. They say states, not in the sense of the states of the US or Australia, they mean countries. So just clarifying. And the second piece that I pulled out of the awareness raising section is that the countries need to encourage organs of the media, so media outlets, newspapers, television, people who run these things, to portray persons with disabilities in a manner that is consistent with the purpose of the proposed convention. So these, inspiration porn articles that say, oh, this person is so fantastic, he overcame his disability, that kind of publicity is not a good thing for us, because what it does is it says that if you work hard enough, the barriers don't matter. And so society doesn't really have to do anything about the barriers, because some people will get over them. Some people will be able to work hard enough and surmount the barriers. But that's not a good message to send out. What we should be saying is barriers are the responsibility of society, and some people with disabilities have a full range of between very successful and not very successful, and we have additional barriers that we encounter that society has a responsibility to remove. That's what we should be saying. And also the message on assisted suicide and euthanasia that comes out so often in the media is that life with a disability is a fate worse than death, and that we'd be better off dead, and that and the media is very biased in the way it talks about these issues. And that is certainly not consistent with the message that the convention wants to put forward, and the government is ordered by this convention to take some responsibility for getting the media outlets to stop doing that. So again, the convention has a goal. It sets the goal, and we have to work using the convention to reach that goal. Okay, Article 9 has to do with accessibility, and it's actually a long article, and I'm not going to read everything because there's way too much. But what it does, it's pretty comprehensive, and it says the accessibility provisions require accessibility codes to be national and to include access to the physical environment, to housing, to transportation, information technology and communication, and other equipment services open to the equipment and services that are open to the public. And so when we get to section 25 on health, that will also concern, for example, not just the hospital buildings, but also the equipment that is in the buildings there needs to be equipment that's adaptable for people with disabilities so that we can have tests and stuff, so lifts and adjustable tables. Article 10 is a very important one because it is the right to life. And it's a short one, so I'll just read it right off, which is that states parties reaffirm that every human being has inherent right to life and shall take all necessary measures to ensure its effective enjoyment by people with disabilities on an equal basis with others. So that means that not only do we have the right to, be kept alive and not be killed against our will, but also that we need to have equal enjoyment of life. And that kind of relates back to the accessibility and integration in society that we'll get to in a little bit. So that's another important one, that the Convention affirms that people with disabilities do have a right to life. Okay. Article 14 talks about liberty and security of the person, and says people with disabilities must enjoy liberty and security of the person on an equal basis with non-disabled people and cannot be arbitrarily deprived of their liberty. And what they're talking about is when, putting people in psychiatric hospitals against their will, or arresting somebody just who, might have a mental or cognitive disability because they're acting strange. That's not okay. You can't just pull somebody off the street and put them in lockup or something. And, the other thing that's never been tried, as far as I know, is the idea of, if somebody needs help with activities of daily living, does failing to provide enough choices so that person can live at home, is that arbitrarily putting them in depriving them of their liberty by making them go into a nursing home or an institution? That is a question that has not been answered legally, and it would be an interesting case because that's certainly a central issue facing people with disabilities and what often makes people want to die. Article 15 talks about freedom from torture or cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment. And in that case, we can look again at the issue of people in nursing homes, what kind of treatment they receive. There was another case that passed by today, and I posted on our Facebook page, I think, of a woman in Florida, or actually it was a man. No, it was a woman. There was a man in Florida whose father has Alzheimer's, and he put a hidden camera in his father's room because his father kept showing up with bruises, and he filmed the nurses abusing his father, or nurses and helpers. So that's the kind of but it actually, that relates to abuses, and that's what comes up next. But the kind of inhumane treatment we talk about is where people only get one bath a week because there's not enough staff to provide people with the kind of with adequate bathing, and if people are rushed to eat because there's not enough staff to take the time somebody needs to eat, that's kind of cruel and inhuman possibilities that we could apply to institutional care. And so Article 16 does relate to freedom from exploitation and violence and abuse. And it says that states need to protect people from abuse and prevent abuse. And there needs to be an independent authority to monitor institutions and investigate and prosecute crimes. So, as often happens when there is abuse in an institution, the abuse may be let go, but there's no criminal prosecution, so that person may just end up working in another nursing home and abuse other people. So, and as we've often talked about, when people with disabilities are abused, the prosecutors and the police tend to react much more slowly and with less interest than if a non-disabled person is assaulted. So those are the kind of things that are supposed to be correct. But again, the law is the goal, and we have to make it between here and the goal. Article 17 talks about integrity of the person. States have an obligation to try to ensure that people's integrity is protected and respected. Article 9 talks about independent living, that living independently, people have a right to live and be included in their communities. And this is a pretty exciting thing to include in this kind of law, because it not only includes that the recognition that people have equal right to live in the community and have choices of where to live equal to others, such as choices of place of residence, and to provide personal assistance services. Again, it's the goal. But how we make it work is our task. But again, this is an issue. This is how we improve people's quality of life, feeling lost their autonomy, lost control in their Let's see if I can. I don't want to do that. Excuse me. In the health legislation for translation. The French version of this section is different from the English version and actually provides better rights. States have to provide free and low-cost services, and they have to provide high-quality services to people with and without disabilities. That's a different standard. So I will have to see if there's a typographical error in the versions of the convention that I'm looking at, or if it's an error in translation and which version is the official one. So I will perhaps get back to this later. But there are some other important things in the health section. One is access to medical facilities. Am I really on here? It says I'm live. Okay. Access to medical facilities and I just wanted to note that that's included in Article 9, Section 1A, the right to equipment to provide access, and it is mentioned in Article 9, Section 1. Paragraph D of Article 25 requires health professionals to provide care of the same quality to persons with disabilities as to others, including on the basis of free and informed consent. So it emphasizes that you cannot provide substandard care to people with disabilities. You cannot put slow codes on the charts of people with intellectual disabilities. You cannot slap a DNR on a person with a disability who comes in for surgery. That is not supposed to be allowed. Again, this is the goal. We have to make it happen. And Section F of Article 25 says that it mandates that we prevent discriminatory denial of health care or health services or food and fluids on the basis of disability. So it is essentially saying that what happened to Nancy Fitzmaurice, the person we're going to talk about shortly, is illegal. It violates international law. So there you go. We knew it. It's right there in writing. There you go. Okay. Habilitation and rehabilitation is also a fairly comprehensive section. I'm not going to go through it, but it is included. So it's part of the section of what people have a right to. I'm going to see if I can make at least the question part come back. Okay, that should work. My title back. Let me see if I can get my title to come back. It's get my title to come. No, it doesn't want to come back. Okay, be that way. Be that way. Okay. Okay, so to do with work and employment. These are factors that contribute to the quality of life of people with disabilities. Article 28 has adequate standard of living, which in this case means adequate adequate food and housing, clean water, disability-related services and equipment, psychological support, and social protection and poverty reduction. All of those need. It does not say that people with disabilities should not poverty because equal in the end. So to the degree that we try to reduce poverty for any population, that needs to be done for people with disabilities as well. So Article 29 has to do with participation in political and public life. And the important piece here is that people with disabilities should have access to voting and the secret ballot without intimidation, but it does not guarantee access to the voting place. That is covered in the United States under the Americans with Disabilities Act and other laws. It should be covered under accessibility laws, but that should be covered, it is not covered under the convention. Okay, so those are the sections of the convention important to talk about. And here are some observations and ideas that were raised at the meeting. As I said, the convention is great and comprehensive as it is, but it doesn't enforce itself. It takes the action and pressure of activists to do it. And unfortunately, it also sometimes takes lawyers. And lawyers cost money, and because, well, sometimes when I used to be a lawyer, it cost money because I needed to live. And then lawyers also have offices and they have staff and there are court fees to pay and copying costs. And you have to submit things to a court. It has to be done in a certain fashion. So there are a lot of costs associated with lawyers. And unfortunately, sometimes that's the only way you can enforce your rights. So since the Charter Challenges program was eliminated, that has made it more difficult for people to enforce their rights. Canada hasn't acted to create an intergovernmental mechanism to put the convention into action. This is pretty sad since the convention was signed in 2006, that's 8 years ago, and Canada ratified in 2010. Although it isn't that surprising because there have been a lot of changes over the past few years that have made it more difficult to enforce the rights of people with disabilities. So not surprising, but still not a great idea. Some of the people said at the meeting that Canada shouldn't ratify the convention with all kinds of fanfare and then ignore it. And as I said before, I think that our position is more of a moral one because we don't really have the resources to enforce it in other senses. Politicians won't want to act publicly in opposition to the principles of the CRPD, the convention. So that could, we can use that to our moral advantage. So for example, if as we oppose the Stephen Fletcher's bill, if we put it against sections of the convention on the rights of people with disabilities and say, this violates this section, et cetera, we will have moral high ground to make that case. We need to be careful, however, because they will continue to make their case that this is an individual issue of individual choice, and there's plenty of language in the convention that talks about individual choice. So we need to be careful that it doesn't backfire on us. As I said before, we need to do awareness because people don't know about the convention. Before this, I knew that the convention existed. I knew it had some provisions that could relate to assisted suicide. I knew that the convention did not specifically say assisted suicide and euthanasia are illegal or not allowed. But I did not know how comprehensive it was and how it thoroughly at least addressed the other issues. And again, saying that something should be doesn't make it real. The CRPD also carries weight because people with disabilities were involved in its development. And that is something that I think gives it a lot of credibility when we present it before legislature. So you can find a link to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities on our Facebook page, and I will put one up on our website as well. So, okay, we have two news briefs. The first is about Brittany Maynard, who is a 29-year-old woman with brain cancer who has attracted a lot of media attention in the United States by declaring her intention to commit suicide through Oregon's assisted suicide program. The group Compassion and Choices, which used to be called the Hemlock Society, is using her story because she's pretty and the photos of her recent fairy tale wedding. She has received a lot of donations from strangers, which she has used to make a trip to the Grand Canyon, the last item on her bucket list, i.e. the list of things she wants to do before she kicks the bucket. She originally said that she would kill herself tomorrow, November 1st. However, she is now saying that she wants to wait. That doesn't say when she has it rescheduled. She was diagnosed with cancer in April of this year, and her doctor gave her a 6-month prognosis, which she has now outlived. This is a point we often make, that prognoses are not accurate, not reliable. So technically she's already, she shouldn't be eligible for Oregon's programs, but I guess she already has the drugs, so there you go. As usual with these things, she says that she is afraid to lose her independence and dignity of becoming disabled as she approaches death. So this is fairly standard in most ways, but she has gotten an awful lot of attention in the US. On the other hand, we've already discussed a little of this situation. Nancy Fitzmaurice. On August 12th, August 21st, attack of dyslexia here, Nancy Fitzmaurice had her feeding tube removed by an extraordinary order from the British court. It's not officially called an extraordinary order. I just put that. It's an order that was pretty extraordinary. This was the first time that a conscious child was killed because a court determined that she was suffering, and Nancy died shortly after the feeding tube was removed. She was 12 years old at the time, and she had several disabilities. Her mother asked for a court order to allow her to die because the mother said that Nancy was suffering and had no quality of life. Her request consisted of a letter of 325 words, which was about a half a page of text. The mother said that Nancy, quote, was screaming in pain 24 hours a day, unquote. Media reports did not indicate if there had been an independent, neutral evaluation of her condition, nor a consultation with pain management experts. In fact, all of the media reporting is very sympathetic to the mother and says very little about Nancy's personality and capacities. Just as in the Latimer case, it is impossible to find objective information about the quality of life that Nancy had and what options she was given for education and to develop herself, which is something the convention talks about in depth. In a related case in May, a legal case was brought in a Wisconsin court by the state's Protection and Advocacy Agency against a hospital which has on several occasions stopped feeding and medical treatment of people with disabilities. Not Dead Yet in the US and other disability groups wrote an amicus brief to the court discussing the disability discrimination inherent in such practices. There are these in a vegetative state. These were people who were conscious and who had physical, sensory, and intellectual disabilities. Okay, so if you have any questions or want to anything that I've talked about today, there are lots of ways to get in touch with me. First, you can email me at info@tv-ndy.ca. Contact Facebook, which is which is @TVNDY, or you can look at our website, which is tvndy.ca. Facebook. Okay. Thank you. Oh, you can also look at our my YouTube channel. Which is my name, but you can search for Euthanasia and Disability and find old videos from earlier discussions to watch at your leisure. For any other information, you can get in touch with me directly. I appreciate your being there, and thank you for having listened, and I hope that you will join me next week for an online about assisted suicide, euthanasia, and people with disabilities. Thank you for joining me. Have a good week. Goodbye.